Hello guys and welcome to today's video. We're gonna be diving into the top 5 ETFs with a tremendous potential for 2025. And whether you're into growth, dividends or a combination of the two, well then you're gonna find it in today's video. And my name is Casper and here we strictly talk about investing and personal finance. So if you do like that type of content, well then press the subscribe button below for more videos just like this one. And before we get to it, then I do want to hear from you guys as well. So please leave a comment below and let me know which ETFs you have in your portfolio at the moment. So moving straight to the first ETF on my list. And here we do have a dividend ETF. And it is of course one of the absolute best performing dividend ETFs out there. And they have beaten the performance of very popular dividend ETFs like SCHD and VIG over the last 12 months. And the ETF that I'm talking about is of course the Fidelity High Dividend ETF. And had you invested just $10,000 into this ETF here 10 years ago, well then today you would have had more than $26,000, and that is a pretty good return in just 10 years. And this ETF is including both small and large cap companies that are expected to keep on increasing that dividend yield every single year. So a really big focus on dividend ability and dividend growth. And that is exactly what we want as dividend investors. And this is actually a dividend ETF with an overweight in information technology. And in fact, then does roughly 28% of the entire portfolio actually consists of this one sector. And that is also very easy to see when looking at their top holdings, where we do find companies like Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, and so on. And another really good thing about this ETF is the diversification, because roughly 9% of the entire portfolio is actually placed in stocks outside of the US, and that gives you a really nice international diversification. And looking at their performance, well then we do see that this ETF is up by more than 23% during the last 12 months, almost 45% during the last 3 years, and since the inception back in 2016, it is up by roughly 177%. And that is a pretty good return. And taking a quick look at their dividends, well then we do see that this ETF does have a dividend yield of roughly 3%, and that is pretty good for an ETF with an overweight in tech stocks. And moving on to the second ETF, and here we do have an ETF that is covering the absolute best sector ever, and that is of course the information technology sector. And the ETF we have is of course the absolute best tech ETF out there. And that is the Vanguard Information Technology ETF. And this ETF is passively managed. And that is why the expense ratio is coming in at just 0.10%. And for that, you get access to the entire US information technology sector. And one of the reasons why this is the best ETF in this sector is because of their diversification. Because they have more than 300 different companies in their portfolio, with biggest positions in companies like Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Broadcom, Salesforce, and so on. And looking at the performance for this ETF, well then we do see that they are up by 29% during the last 12 months. And looking at the last 3 years, well then are they up by 63%. And looking at the last 5 years, well then are they up by more than 156%. And that is an absolutely amazing return. If you don't have exposure to the information technology sector in your portfolio, well then I would highly recommend that you do take a look at this one ETF here. And moving on to the third ETF, and here we do have the best growth ETF out there. However, this one has been neglected a little bit recently, and that is due to the big performance of ETFs like VGT for example. But the ETF that I am talking about is the Invesco QQQ ETF. And had you invested just $10,000 into this one ETF 10 years ago, well then today you would have had more than $53,000. And that is an absolutely insane return with an average growth per year of 18%. And the ETF is also in the top 5 of the biggest ETFs in the world when looking at assets under management. And it gives you access to the top 100 companies in the Nasdaq Composite Index. And that consists of the absolute best companies in the world within information technology, cloud data, big data, augmented reality, and everything else that you can think of. And QQQ has an expense ratio of just 0.2%, and the fund has 102 holdings in total, with biggest positions in companies like Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and so on. And over the last 10 years, the fund has basically doubled the return of the S&P 500 index, with a total return of more than 435% compared to the 242 for the S&P 500. And that is absolutely insane to think about. So moving on to the next ETF. And here we do have another dividend ETF. And the ETF that I'm talking about right now is actually my personal favorite dividend ETF. And that is the Swap US Dividend Equity ETF, better known as SCHD. And this is the second biggest ETF in the world when looking at assets under management. And it offers a very nice dividend yield of 3.5%. And the dividend has grown on average more than 13% every single year since the inception back in 2011. And for a really low expense ratio of just 0.06%, then you do get access to the best 103 high-yielding growth blue chip stocks in the US. And had you invested just $10,000 into this one ETF here 10 years ago, well then today you would have had more than $29,000, and that is a pretty good return. And you would also get more than $1,000 every single year in pure dividends. And the goal of this ETF is to find high quality dividend yielding companies with more than 10 years of consecutive dividend growth. And right now, then do they have 103 high quality stocks in their portfolio with biggest positions in companies like Pfizer, Cisco, Coca-Cola, Chevron, and so on. And the last ETF is the biggest ETF in the entire world. And it is also the largest ETF within my personal portfolio. And it should be a staple in every single investor's portfolio. And the ETF I'm talking about is of course the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, ticker symbol VOO. And this ETF here does contain the 500 largest publicly traded companies within the US. So with this ETF, you're only going to get the 500 best performing stocks in the entire US stock market, like Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, and so on. So why is this ETF here my personal favorite ETF and the favorite ETF amongst so many other investors? And that is simply because by buying this ETF here, you're basically getting the best and most optimized diversification that you can possibly get. And you get all of that for a really low expense ratio of just 0.03%. And beating the returns of the S&P 500 index is something that only a very few people can do consistently every single year. And that is also easy to see why when you do see the returns of the S&P 500. The ETF has given an average annual return of more than 13% during the last 10 years and more than 14.6% average annual return since the inception back in 2010. And that is exactly why it is my personal favorite ETF. A very low expense ratio, a really nice diversification, and a really good return. So these were the top ETFs that you need to keep an eye out for in 2025. And you should at least know about all of these ETFs as an investor. And that was all I had today. Thank you for watching the video, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos just like this one. See you guys in the next video.